Well, hello. I'm Mark Pinto coming to you from Phoenixville Public Library. Welcome to tonight's Zoom with author Caroline Ailanthus, who we had a couple of years ago when she came out with her previous novel, Ecological Memory, which was about a pandemic and which she wrote before our actual pandemic occurred. And now we have her with us tonight to talk about her new novel, a follow-up to Ecological Memory called Bifurcation Events. A little bit about Caroline. She grew up in Delaware, attended schools in New England mostly. She has a BA in environmental leadership and an MS in conservation biology. She lives now in Maryland with her husband and assorted dogs and cats. And when she's not writing, she can usually be found either walking her beagles or making a complete mess of the kitchen. She's taken some time away from her mess to be with us tonight. Caroline, welcome.
Hi, thanks for inviting me. I'm glad we could get this set up. We're just gonna jump in here. Uh, my name's Caroline Ailanthus. I'm here to talk about my book, Bifurcation Events. You see that here? Uh, gonna introduce the book to you, read a little bit of it. I have some questions at the end that you've given me that I will answer. And here we go. The best way to introduce a book is to read its blurb. So I'm just going to do that first. There are moments that divide life into before and after. Death can do it. Any disease can. But so can miracles. So can love. Andy, a scientist, calls these moments bifurcation events, a technical term that may or may not apply literally. He's seen his share most dramatically in the complete collapse of the civilization of his youth and the beginnings of another. His story, or part of it, was told in the novel Ecological Memory. Here are the related stories of some of his family and friends. One novel, two novellas, five short stories, bifurcation events. So these stories are of varying lengths. They share most of their characters. They all exist in the same world. And it's probably better to read them in order, but they are all distinct, separate. What unites them is a common theme of the bifurcation event, a radical change that can't be predicted from prior conditions alone, but in retrospect is kind of obvious. There are those moments in life where you think things are going to keep going the way they've been, and they just don't. And for better or worse, you have to deal with it. Um, Let me share with you some examples. Uh, I'll start by reading the whole first story. It's the shortest. This story is entitled Cold, Uncertain Dawn. Elsie woke to cold, the scent of cold, of snow, of tent fabric. The coldness felt good on her hot skin. Confusion. She wasn't in her room. The child fell asleep again before she could figure it out. Nothing seemed worth thinking through. Her head hurt, her chest hurt, her tummy hurt, her breath wouldn't come right. She slept again. She woke, Daddy feeding her soup. It tasted funny. Daddy had put something in it to make her feel better. Try to have some, he said. You have to stay hydrated. Where's Jamie? Shh, said Daddy. Consciousness came and went. She snuggled down under blankets in her own bag, shivering, then struggled out of her bag and threw off the blankets, burning up. In the daytime, the walls were luminous. She was in a tent. She kept forgetting that. To poo, she had to go outside and squat in the snow. She always had to poo. Her butt hurt. Her breath, reflected back at her face from the inside of her sleeping bag, burned her eyes. She had a moment of clarity, of fledgling analysis. I have a fever, so my breath is too hot for my eyes. And my sleeping bag is wet because I'm sweating even though I feel cold. It's because I have a fever. But mostly she couldn't think much. Then she had to poo again. There had been other people. When she was awake enough to think through anything, she could remember that. The camping trip, not to either of the campgrounds, Blackwoods or Seawall, but to a spot way up in the woods they had to hike to, carrying all their stuff, so much stuff, all of it heavy, uphill through the snow, with Daddy and Jamie and those two women who were Daddy's friends, and their kid who was Elsie's own age, but seemed sort of shy or stuck up, and then started coughing and turned blotchy. I'm going to remember everything for show and tell when we get back to school, Elsie had said. We're not going back, Jamie had told her. You don't know anything. She hated it when he got that superior tone just because he was older, but he was right. She hardly knew anything, and that was almost okay because he would explain it all to her eventually. He always did that. But then everybody got sick, spotted and blotchy, and the others went into separate tents or something because they weren't around anymore. And everything got confusing, and Elsie couldn't think right or breathe right, and now she had to go poo again. Daddy? Daddy had been gone a long time. She went to sleep while he wasn't in the tent, and when she woke up, he still wasn't there. Daddy? When he got back, he looked tired and sad and sort of gray in the face. He sat down on a sleeping pad just like he used to, on the edge of her bed back at home. He asked all his questions. Are you warm, cold, hungry, thirsty? How's your tummy? He felt her forehead, asked her to breathe deep so he could listen. This time when she breathed, she didn't cough, though breathing still hurt. She didn't really feel like talking. She sort of fell asleep, but not really. Nothing much was anything really these days. She lay there, sort of sleeping, but not really, and Daddy rubbed her ear so she felt a little better. After a while, Daddy spoke. It's just you and me now, kid, he said. But don't worry, I can take care of us. We have plenty of food, plenty of ammunition. I know lots of wild plants we can eat. And there's deer here. We can have a garden, too. You'll like having a garden. There's fish in the lake. I'll teach you to fly fish. How about that? No one will find us. We'll be safe here. Don't worry. But there's one thing I need you to do for me, Elsie, Elzita, Elsie girl. I need you to just not die. Not now. Because I need to have someone to care for. I can't do this alone. The inside of the tent smelled cold and musty. The daylight through the tent walls was starting to fade. Elsie never afterwards remembered him saying that, but for the rest of her life, when she thought about those weeks in the tent while one world, one life ended and something else began, she wondered if something like that had been said. These bifurcation events are not always sad, or at least not only sad. Let me read you the first few paragraphs of another story. I should say before we do this, this Bifurcation Events is a sequel, but you don't need to have read the other book first. They're both designed to stand alone. All right, so this next is an excerpt, the first few paragraphs of a story called I'll Be Seeing You. And Elsie is an adult now in this one. There are too many people in this room, Elsie whispered. 400 some sat around and behind her, most of them talking loudly. Since moving to the cabin in the woods, she'd started forgetting how to deal with strangers. You've never seen a train station in Mumbai, Diana, her traveling companion, replied, amused. I'm glad I haven't. But she'd come to this conference to network. How is she supposed to meet people if the people had her out of sorts? Until she just did it without thinking. I like your hair, she told the stranger to her right. Do you really? If I were going to start buttering people up, Elsie said, why would I start with you? I don't know you from Eve. The woman threw back her head and laughed. She was tall, slim, and slightly angular. Her hair, very short, very straight, was salt with a little pepper and a generous but irregular splash of purple. The cowl is new, she explained slowly, thoughtfully, lightly. I wanted to make my hair match it, but the shade didn't come out right. The cowl, along with black or brown tunic and trousers or a skirt, was professional dress these days. Everyone in the room wore one, usually tipped back off the head and spread across the shoulders. The cowl's color pattern identified the user's guild, but Elsie didn't recognize this woman's soft shades of gray, blue, and purple. Quite elegant, though no, the purples didn't match. The cowl, along with the sorry, missed my place. The purples didn't match. The woman wore a senior guild member pin on her chest, a small silver ankh in the cartilage of her left ear, and a gold wedding band on her right ring finger. How did you do it? Elsie asked. Blackberry juice. Really? I'd have eaten the blackberries. I'd have eaten them too, except. And the woman paused thoughtfully for so long that she didn't get to finish before a young man wearing a black and green cowl took the stage and called the first session to order. There hadn't been a conference like this since before the collapse 26 years ago. Maybe there'd never been one before. After all, before, environmentalists of all stripes had been playing defense, fighting a long retreat. That the old way of life would itself end was inevitable. That's what unsustainable means. But how much of the world would be destroyed first? Conservation scientists met to discuss how much could be saved and for how long. They wanted the end to come soon, but deliberately, gently, justly. Instead, the pandemic struck, and while too many people lay sick at once, the convoluted supply chains made possible, actually economically inevitable, by fossil fuel failed, and 5 billion people starved. The survivors, grieving, terrified, rebuilt on a different basis and left fossil fuel and its promises and risks behind. And the world began to green. Now, a generation later, professional scientists and educators and so forth gathered again. But the questions they were asking had changed. These people and the others attending similar conferences elsewhere wanted to know not how can we slow decline, but how do we aid recovery? But however exciting the conference as a whole, the first session was boring, introductory, bureaucratic, and seemingly inevitable. When it finally ended, a mass exodus towards the toilets began. Elsie caught at the sleeve of the purple-haired woman, asking, "Except what?" The question was pointless. Nobody could remember an interrupted thought that long. Anybody would look at Elsie oddly, even for asking. But the woman did not look at her oddly. "Except there is a sense in which something other than the body needs to be fed," she explained. "The spirit hungers for beauty, or silly hair, or something." She smiled and turned again to go, but stopped when a voice called Elsie's name. Now, this disease they're talking about, it's the same disease that formed the backdrop from the previous book, Ecological Memory, which is set 20 years after a global pandemic triggered the collapse of civilization. The funny thing is, I wrote Memory before COVID happened, so I really didn't know what living through something like that would be like. I guessed, and COVID didn't come close to crashing civilization, but it came close to coming close, if that makes sense. Close enough to give us a taste, to make us worry. And it wasn't like what I had imagined. I got some things right. I got some things strangely right. But other things, I'd written about riots, panic, people being awful to each other, but that's not what happened, or not all of what happened. You remember, the world went quiet. It went sweet. It went terrifying. So for the next book, this Bifurcation Events, I didn't retcon anything. It's still the same fictional world, but I added a lot. The two novellas in the collection are both set partly during the fictional pandemic and collapse, as is that first story. So they explore the planetary bifurcation event at a depth the first book really couldn't. Here's an excerpt from one of those novellas. I should explain that Luc is French-Canadian, devoutly Catholic, and a recovering addict, and that in this excerpt, which occurs partway through the story, his two adult children have just died. This excerpt is from the novella, No Matter How Far Down. Nothing much mattered to Luke after that. He watched the news mechanically. There were international efforts at developing a vaccine, a test, some kind of treatment. It all seemed very optimistic, except nobody was confident any of that would be ready for widespread use in time to make a difference. There were huge gaps on store shelves, supply chain problems, they said, exacerbated by panicky hoarding. There were online black markets in toilet paper, hand sanitizer, macaroni, duct tape. Why duct tape? Nothing made sense. The United States began a cold shutdown of all its nuclear reactors and all its refineries and any other facilities that might cause problems if abandoned. Canada followed suit. Other countries were doing similar things. The implications were plain, but nobody said it out loud. Luke didn't much care either way. His children were dead. His mother died, and suddenly he could care again, care about everything, but in a strange, exhausted, shell-shocked way. Maman had survived the disease, but supply chain problems included medications. She was diabetic and had a weak heart. Her funeral was simply put off. It was that or mass graves these days. Bodies filled refrigerator trucks parked in rows near hospital morgues. Days went slowly, but weeks went fast. There was no time to respond to one disaster before the next arrived. Supposedly wearing masks would help slow transmission, and people who happened to have them wore them. But there weren't enough, and there was no time to make enough. Sewing circles and factories alike retooled and started making protective equipment. But the fruits of their labor went into hospitals and nursing homes, and still doctors and nurses had to reuse the few masks they had. There was no question of protection for the men in the street. The electrical grid grew erratic. There was new faces reporting the news as the anchors sickened or left to care for the sick and were replaced on air by producers and interns. Riots spread through the United States. The politics there had been getting increasingly volatile in recent years, and now it seemed no one trusted anyone. That contagion, too, seemed likely to enter Canada. Francine went missing. Then Andy, Philippe's other boy, the smart one, went missing. Some tired-sounding official called in the middle of the night saying something about Philippe, and Luke just about went ape on her until he realized what she was saying was true. Philippe was dead, apparently mugged for gasoline in his car. Luke now, for the first time in his life, had no brothers. He did not seriously contemplate drinking or screwing. Nothing is so bad that a slip won't make it worse, as they say. But he called Michelle to ask why he shouldn't commit suicide. You mean, aside from the going to hell bit? Yes, aside from that. Well, it's wrong. That's the reason for the going to hell bit. I know, but why? We're going to die anyway, right? There's no coming back from this. You don't know that. You don't know what God has planned for you. Anyway, even if you do die soon, maybe you can let him use your death for something good. What? I don't know. People died at home waiting for ambulances. They died in parked ambulances waiting outside overfilled emergency rooms. They died on gurneys in hallways of hospitals. The increasingly spotty and amateurish news coverage was full of such stories. There were no free beds at the hospitals, no available ventilators, and never enough staff because doctors and nurses were becoming patients or committing suicide. During shift changes at the hospitals, the neighbors would lean out their windows and clap and cheer, throw handmade greeting cards or sometimes roses. All through the city at dusk, people would lean out their windows and sing. Birthdays, wedding anniversaries, and deaths were acknowledged by chalk drawings in the streets. Nobody ever saw the artists, only the art. There were no planes in the sky anymore. Only clouds, only birds, only stars. Luke, walking home one day from the grocery. You no longer went in. You handed a list to an employee and waited till they returned with full shopping bags and a miniature credit card counter. Nobody was taking cash. Varied his route, making his way through a lovely upscale neighborhood where he'd never before been. The streets here had not yet been plowed, though the last snow had been 3 days ago. He almost didn't notice the anomaly, so common had such lapses become. He was picking his way through an icy patch when, from above him, on a balcony, came notes played on a cello, familiar notes. Luke stopped and looked up, trying to spot the performer. He could not. The angle was bad. But while he searched, another performer, this one on a trumpet, joined in from a different balcony. Then another on a guitar and another on a violin. All around him, musicians, some talented, some otherwise, rushed to grab their instruments and joined in. They were all playing Leonard Cohen's Alleluia. When the song finished, there was a moment of silence, and then the invisible cellist started again. The same song, presumably to give the others a chance to play it from the beginning. Only this time the cellist also sang, and suddenly voice after voice lifted. The entire neighborhood appeared to consist of Leonard Cohen fans. They all knew all the words, the voices of people through open wintry windows, voices of people whom Luke did not know and mostly could not see. Luke knew the words too, and he joined in, whispering along at first, then singing loudly, not caring for the moment about whether his voice might be good enough. He too had been undone by moonlight. He'd paced floors. He'd lived alone. And he expected no victory march, not for himself, not for anyone else, not anymore. And he sang and felt himself heard, a baffled and a broken king alone in an empty, snow-piled street crying, Alleluia, Alleluia, Alleluia. In his voice, it became an accusation. It became a plea, a question for which he heard no answer. It became his praise of God. The longest story in the book, actually a short novel, is the one that is most obviously a sequel of Ecological Memory. It shows the protagonists from the earlier book, plus some new characters, about 15 years later. So if you've read Memory, you now get to see what Andy and Elsie are up to. What they're up to is studying history. See, the thing is that Mount Desert Island in Maine, that's a map of part of it on the cover here. That's Long Pond. Shortly after I started visiting the island years ago, I had a dream about a forest fire, the island of fire, me trying to find a boat so I could escape, but there were no boats. I think I had that dream more than once. And when I told my friend and teacher, Tom Wessels, about it, about the dream, he said, well, that's interesting because that really happened. And he told me about the Bar Harbor fire of 1947, when thousands of people were all trapped down by the docks with the fire coming on, and there were no boats. I still don't know how or why I was dreaming about a forest fire I'd never heard of. But I wrote a little novel about why someone else might have had the same dream. I added the other stories on afterwards, this little flock of thematically related explorations. So I'm not going to tell you who has the dream in the book, or why, or what the characters do about it. You'll have to read all that yourself. But I do want to read you a passage describing the fire itself. A word of explanation. This passage starts out with a character thinking about how a particular site might have looked before the fire. And then it shifts into a kind of immersive, imaginative vision he has of the historical fire itself. So this is an excerpt from the novel Root Connections. What were in those beds besides blueberries and lily of the valley? Purple-flowered rhodora, surely, and also white-flowering Labrador tea, huckleberry, and sheep laurel, purple again, each arranged so that one after another bloomed and faded. The whole remained visually balanced and lovely. Snowberry, crowberry, mountain cranberry, and crowbroom must have crept like green throw rugs over the stones that made up the bones of this place, and three-toothed cinquefoil and black chokeberry sprouted from the soil, caught in the deliberately incompletely mortared joints between the stones. Multiple species of arcing fern fronds, crouching juniper bushes, dark-leaved withrod, young northern white cedars with their flat sprays of aromatic foliage all provided contrast and enriched the visual texture of the whole. Small, slim shad trees provided color, white flowers against wine red spring foliage at the beginning of the growing season, while young sugar maples did the same at the end. Rose had written extensively about the importance of painting with plants, not only in space, but also in time, and for multiple audiences, for the human eye and also for the needs of mammals, birds, and insects, so they would have food, cover, and places to raise their young throughout the year. The multiple water features, mostly small, shallow pools, but also winding, intermittent streams accommodated frogs, toads, salamanders, newts, turtles, and the nymphs of dragonflies. The gardener, Rose, painted with animals as well as with plants, in sound as well as in color, aiming for frog song in May, fireflies in June, monarch butterflies in July, deer gambling through hoar-frosted grasses as autumn came on. From the house, you could see all of it. From that brooding, simple yet grand wooden structure with a stone foundation, brick chimneys, and multiple porches, you could look out over the water gardens and the rock gardens and the deer-haunted meadows, look deep into the surrounding forest that largely screened the road from view, look out across the green and sloping land from the northeast out to the blue and shining sea. Only the land wasn't green today. Not all green. It was orange and yellow and brown and winter gray, the bare or autumnal deciduous trees peeking through, scattered among the dark pines and spruces, because it was October. It is October. It is 1947. It is Thursday, between 3 and 4 in the afternoon. Half a dozen people are carrying armloads of things out of the house and packing them in a large station wagon. The wind has just changed. They can hear it, a rising gale out of the north, and they know what it means. Yet now they stand irresolute, each frozen in place by a different set of uncertainties. They can't all fit in the already loaded vehicle. To drive away to safety, they need Mrs. McCarthy to come back. She went to the post office to mail out a box of her most precious things. She's not back yet, and anyway, not everything the people had meant to take has been loaded. Should they abandon their employer's things and run? What about their own things? What about the houses and the gardens and the woods, their own attachments and loyalties? Is anywhere going to be safe? Already they can hear the fire. They can smell the fire on the wind. Gravel sprays as another car, an altogether nicer one, tears up the driveway, turns around in front of the garage, comes back and brakes hard behind the house. Drop everything, let's go, shouts Kathleen McCarthy before she's all the way out of her car. Come on. Dot won't come, said Mr. Stevens, coming out of the house. He and his wife were the only two in the group who didn't work for Mrs. McCarthy, but are instead her dear friends. Dot is the maid. She's very young and doesn't think clearly when she's frightened. She's just run back into the house. Plainly, Mr. Stevens wants to be gallant and go in after her. There is no time. Ugh, cries Mrs. McCarthy, exasperated. You make sure everybody gets into the cars. I'll go get Dot, and she runs into the house. The others finish loading whatever they're carrying, but a few things don't fit and must stay. The people get in. Mr. Stevens at the wheel of one car, the other's driver's seat's empty. But one woman, her arms full of botany texts and notebooks, still hasn't gotten in. The others are calling to her, but she ignores them. She looks around wildly. The trees, the shrubs, the sitting areas mowed into the grass, each one with its own wooden benches and tables, like favorite rooms. The fish, the poor little fish. The wind is carrying sparks now. The smoke, thick smoke, the column of it unbelievably huge seen this close, leans up over the house and then blots out the sun. The others call again. She's not listening. Rosestone stares in longing horror at her gardens, the closest thing to a child she and her dead husband will ever share. Mrs. McCarthy comes out of the house, pulling the weeping Dot by her hand. She shoves the girl into the car in the care of Mr. and Mrs. Stevens, who will make sure she doesn't get out again. Rose dumps her books into the footwell of the front passenger seat of the other car as Mrs. McCarthy jumps in behind the wheel. I can't go, Rose tells her employer, stammering but decisive. I I need a minute. Chris's garden. I'll meet you at the foot of the driveway. The two women look at each other. They are not of the same generation, and despite Rose's moneyed upbringing, they are not now the same social class. And yet they are alike. Hurry, Mrs. McCarthy tells her. We'll wait as long as we can. Rose shuts the door and the cars speed off. She looks around one last time, and the roar of the coming fire fills her ears. It has crested the hill above her and to the immediate north. She is second, she knows. Her eyes fall on the white oak. A field-grown tree is out of place and as yet at home here as she is, her vegetative friend. She has always felt safe with him. Her, she fights an urge to hug the trunk, to climb up into the spreading branches and hide. The tree explodes. The thing is, when I first imagined that scene, it was wholly fictional. The fire was real, but I wasn't going to base the scene on anything real that happened in the fire. I just wanted to make sure I put it on the correct side of town for the direction I wanted the fire to move, so the scene would feel plausible. But then I found out there was actually a story very much like what I had imagined, except that in real life, the gardener gets to the car, and I was able to find the ruins of that house. I went back with my friend and teacher Tom and my husband Chris. Both of them are relevant experts, and I listened in as they analyzed the site. I took notes. I made the adjustments I needed to make in the story. In fact, some of the dialogue from earlier in that scene is simply theirs. And it was such a privilege, not only to listen in to such expert analysis, but simply to find that site, to visit it. It felt like visiting a grave. Um, Nobody died there that day. I mean, other than the trees. No humans died there. They all escaped. There were no fatalities at that site, but it was somebody's beloved home. A home died there, and it was gone forever. The owner never went back, never went rebuilt. And I don't know where she spent the rest of her days. There are days that change the world forever, for a person, for a community, sometimes for the whole planet. And afterwards, you simply live your life. Bifurcation events. So you sent me a couple of questions, and I'm happy to answer them. First question. Several of the reviews for your book remark on how positive, how hopeful your vision is. Where does that hope come from? Uh, there's really two ways I can answer that question, so I'll answer it both ways. One is the literary decision. How and why did I decide to write the book that way? The thing is that I don't find death and disaster and horror and awfulness interesting enough to spend a couple of years writing about it. I I mean, really, I'll watch Mad Max for an evening or something. I don't want to write the thing. And I don't think I need to write the thing because I don't think you need to read the thing. What speculative fiction does, or one of the things that it can do, is tell people about possibilities. Yeah, the great thing about dystopic fiction, like 1984 or The Handmaid's Tale, uh, things like that, is it's a warning. Hey, there's some things going on, and if they keep going in the direction they're going, these bad things could happen. So maybe we'd better think about doing something different. But the thing is, we know that already at this point, right? We know that our society is unsustainable. We know that we're vulnerable in many ways. Um, We could get another pandemic just because we've had one horrible one doesn't mean we won't have another one. I mean, things are kind of iffy for us right now. We know that already. We know the future could turn out to be awful. Um, but you know what happens when like somebody turns on a car alarm and it keeps going and going and go. You stop hearing it after a while, right? So the world doesn't need another book about how the future could be awful. The world does need another book about how the future could actually be really great. The transition at this point is likely to be pretty bad, although maybe not. Maybe we can still pull something out. Um, but the world is going to change. That's what unsustainable means, right? Means we can't sustain it. We can't keep going like this. Uh, but change doesn't have to mean bad. It doesn't have to mean destruction and loss. The future can be really good. And I figure if more of us believe that, maybe we'll be more proactive about making sure it happens. So that's the literary reason. The personal answer, where I get that hope is frankly, I write novels. Um, yeah, I'm getting so cynical and so stressed out. It's bad. I mean, really. And part of what I do to cope is I write about uh, futures or alternative worlds or just options where the things that I hope happen do. Uh, and that keeps me going. So, where do I get my hope? I get it from making these things. You asked the name Bifurcation Events. I had to look that up. Why did you go with that name? Did you have a particular readership in mind? I think what you're asking is did I write the book for scientists who already know what the phrase bifurcation events means? No, I did not. Um, Anybody can read my books. They're written for a general audience. Uh, it helps if you like science, but you don't need to know anything about it. Um, I want scientists who do read my books to respect them. I want everything to be accurate and well thought out. But you don't need a degree um, to enjoy my writing. I know that most of my readers are not going to know what the phrase bifurcation events means until I tell them, and that's okay. I'm hoping that it will sound intriguing and that it will suggest some kind of division. Um, okay, bifurcation events. That means something gets divided in two and there's a series of events. Okay, that's kind of accurate, actually. So, see, with the first book in the series, Ecological Memory, um, I chose the name ecological memory because it is a technical term that relates to the theme of the book. But to somebody who doesn't know the technical meaning, it suggests maybe, well, ecological memory, that's remembering trees or forests or something, which is also central to the theme of the book. So I have this double meaning going on. And I was going for the same thing here with bifurcation events. All right, what else? What's the best advice you've ever gotten? Okay. Uh, See, that's a little bit difficult because uh, the best advice I've gotten was the advice that I needed at the particular moment that I needed it. Like, write an outline. That was really good advice. Be brief. That's really good advice too. Be less pretentious. Good advice. But yeah, that advice isn't necessarily going to be good advice for everybody. Maybe you don't need to be brief. Maybe you need to be more wordy, more descriptive. It's not necessarily great advice for me for other times. There may be other times when I do need to be more descriptive. I doubt there's any time that I need to be pretentious, but maybe. Um, the best advice is always the advice that you need right now. And that's very specific and it's very personal. It's an answer. I don't mean personal like whatever. I mean specific to me. Um, the best advice is an answer to a question. So you need the question for it to make sense. Um, I have encountered some advice that wasn't, it was in a book or something that I read and it was very useful. Like one I think about a lot. I think Annie Dillard wrote it, actually. She said that writing is this process of exploration and creative destruction. Like you're in a house and you're knocking down walls that aren't load bearing. You have to get rid of everything that doesn't serve the story in one way or another, including things that you thought were going to be your point. Yeah, sometimes the writing changes and the story or the essay or whatever it is just ends up being about something different than you expected it to be. And that great little paragraph that you thought was going to completely encapsulate the main point of the whole thing, it just has to go. That's great advice. And it's applicable most of the time for writers. You have to let the work lead. You can't put your preferences ahead of the work. The work has to be in charge. The great little point that you were going to put in, stick that in another file somewhere and save it for later. Um, you have to let the work lead. Um, are any of your characters based on real people? Um, yes and no. Uh, I often use real people as models. Uh, Usually people I know, sometimes not. Sometimes famous people or historical people or whoever else. I use them as models the same way that a painter might use a model. You're not painting a portrait. You're not trying to make the image look like the model. What you're doing is you're using the model to help you, like, oh, how does that arm foreshorten? And how do those shadows work? And okay, how does when someone turns their head, what does their neck do? And that sort of thing. And I do the same thing in my writing. Um, Most of the time, and really ideally, the finished character doesn't resemble the model at all. Um, I don't want readers to be able to guess who the model was because the model, their personality and life story and all of that, that's theirs. That's not mine. And I have no right to take it and put it in a book. So I learn what I can from using them as models, and then I create this fictional person afterwards. There is an exception in this book, a character who I wrote as a tribute to a friend of mine um, who has died, and it's nothing but complimentary to her. So I think that's all right. I don't know if actually I did ask a mutual acquaintance, and she said that she was recognizable. So that was good to hear. Um, but basically, if you read one of my books and you think, oh yeah, she based that character off of me. No, I didn't. Um, what surprised you in the course of writing this book? This book? Really, how hard it was? I had an idea for a nice little sequel, and it's like it didn't want to be written or something. And for years, I was struggling with this. Like, do I edit it this way? Do I change it that way? Do I tweak this? Do I do that? And it just would not work. And eventually, I kind of had to sit down with my own book and say, look, do you want to get written or not? Because if you want to get written, I need you to work with me here. I need to know what I'm supposed to be doing. Uh, and I talked to people about it, had people read, I went through this whole long process. And eventually I realized that uh, I didn't have an idea for, your standard 250, 300 page novel. I had, not a smaller idea, but an idea that needed fewer pages. Um, and that if I shrunk it in, um, it would hold together better. I wouldn't need, subplots and side plots and extra stuff to enrich it and fill it out. I could just, boom, this is the story. This is what happens. So that's what I did. And I rewrote the story to be about half of the original projected length. And then I added in the other stories, most of which I'd already had written at that point. I was planning on putting them into a later short fiction collection, and I still have some. There's still some you haven't seen yet. They'll come out later, but I made it into a collection. So that was a big surprise. Um, your bio mentions you like walking your dogs and making a mess of the kitchen. True. It does, and I do. I don't know about like making a mess in the kitchen. I like cooking, and when I cook, I make a mess in the kitchen. My husband once said, "Oh, so what are you making?" And something fell apart and splattered all over the place right when he answered that. So I said, "A mess." Anyway, do your hobbies get into your writing at all? Well, yeah, I don't really differentiate between hobbies and non-hobbies. I just have interests. I have things I like to do. Um, and yeah, they get into my writing. Um, I love science. My books are science heavy. History's a big interest of mine. Psychology's a big interest of mine. So all that gets in. Um, there's a dog in this book. Nothing like my beagles, but he's still a dog. Timogen. He's fun. He's based on a real dog. Um, um, different breed though. Anyway, where was I? Cooking gets in. It's a lot of food in my books. My sense is that because I write stories that are set in worlds that aren't ours. So my sense is that if I let you know how my characters eat and what they eat and all of that, it'll help you immerse yourself in their world a bit more. And so there's several feasts in the book, and I'm doing research to do it, like going online and looking up um, directions on how to make a Japanese style strawberry shortcake. And read the book; you'll find the Japanese strawberry shortcake in there. Anyway, any chance of this book becoming a movie? If any of you have the means to make a movie of my book, I will definitely negotiate. I have my standards. We would have to negotiate, have to, but yeah, I'm open. I'm available. Um, uh, and I'm about to run out of batteries. So, this has been a lot of questions, and I think we've kind of had enough. Um, Thank you for letting me do this. I hope you read my book. I hope you like it. Uh, Feel free to, find me on social media, give a shout, tell me what you think. I'm the only Caroline Ailanthus in the world that makes my work. My name makes a great search term. So I'm on Amazon. I'm on my publisher's website, their Saltwater Media. Just look for my name, Caroline Ailanthus, and you'll get my books. And uh, I think the library has a copy. I'm not sure. Uh, so I'll be seeing you around. Thanks very much for having me.
Yes, Caroline, we do have your book here, indeed. Thanks so much for being with us, me and our patrons today, and best of luck on the next book, and we'll see you on the next go around. Take care now. And thanks everyone for joining us today.